Welcome to Geo Wars Explained, where every war is not just a story. Disclaimer: this channel provides commentary and analysis on historical and crumps.
Hold the line! Push forward! They are boarding! Stop them! Clear the deck!
Just imagine an empire controlling 44% of the world's population, mobilizing its vast resources against a fractured collection of rocky peninsulas. The Persian Achaemenid Empire possessed limitless wealth, unparalleled engineering capabilities, and a military apparatus that had effortlessly swallowed Babylon and Egypt. Greek city-states, conversely, were fiercely divided, economically impoverished, and entirely incapable of fielding a unified standing army. When the dust settled at the end of 479 BC, the mighty Persian war machine had been shattered, and the political map of the Aegean remained completely unchanged. This astonishing outcome defies the standard historical logic that massive demographic and economic advantages inevitably guarantee military conquest. The popular history attempts to explain this survival by pointing to the inherent superiority of Western freedom or the unique martial spirit of the Spartans. These romanticized narratives fundamentally obscure the actual mechanics of ancient warfare and statecraft. The Persian military did not fail because its soldiers lacked courage or because its commanders were uniquely incompetent. The Greek coalition did not survive because they possessed a higher moral destiny or an invincible infantry formation. This outcome was the mechanical result of a massive imperial system colliding with an environment that completely neutralized its primary operational advantages. The illusion of inevitable Persian victory shatters when one examines the severe structural limitations of projecting power across the ancient Mediterranean. Empires cannot simply march millions of men into hostile territory without constructing a flawless mechanism to feed, hydrate, and equip them daily. The Persian invasion force, regardless of its exact historical size, was an artificial city that had to be continuously sustained while constantly moving. Greece was not a fertile river valley like the Nile or the Tigris, but a jagged landscape incapable of supporting sudden demographic explosions. Thus, the war was never truly a contest of manpower, but a relentless battle against environmental friction. To comprehend this geopolitical failure, one must shift the analytical focus away from the personalities of Xerxes and Leonidas. The invasion of Greece was not a story of kingly ego, but rather a colossal logistical enterprise attempting to operate beyond its sustainable radius. Yet Persia relied on a sophisticated system of overland depots and massive naval escorts to project power across vast distances. The Greek defense relied on exploiting localized geographic bottlenecks to artificially restrict the deployment of overwhelming numbers. The conflict was ultimately a test of whether Persian supply lines could survive the friction of Greek topography long enough to force political capitulation. The fundamental architecture of the Persian military required constant, massive influxes of food and water that the Greek landscape simply could not provide. Moving hundreds of thousands of soldiers and pack animals across the arid, mountainous terrain of the Balkans placed immediate, severe stress on imperial logistics. Persian engineers bridged the Hellespont and carved canals through peninsulas, and demonstrating incredible administrative capacity to alter the physical world. However, altering the landscape is entirely different from sustaining a massive invasion force in a hostile, resource-poor environment for an extended duration. The Persian operational window was therefore strictly limited by the finite carrying capacity of their accompanying supply fleet. This reliance on a complex, dual-pronged advance meant that the Persian army and navy operated as a single fragile biological organism. The ground forces provided physical security for the fleet's anchorages, while the fleet provided the caloric fuel required by the ground forces. If either component were to be significantly delayed or damaged, the entire imperial apparatus would experience immediate cascading failures. The Greek city-states fundamentally understood this interdependence and structured their entire defensive strategy around severing this vital connection. By targeting the systemic links rather than the raw military output, the Greeks effectively turned the size of the Persian army into a fatal vulnerability. The Persian supply chain was further compromised by the technological limitations of ancient maritime transport. Triremes and transport vessels of the era lacked deep water navigation capabilities, forcing them to remain incredibly close to the treacherous shoreline. This proximity to the rocky coast made the armada highly vulnerable to sudden, localized weather anomalies that frequently plagued the Aegean Sea. Early in the campaign, massive summer storms violently destroyed hundreds of Persian supply ships anchored off the coast of Magnesia. This catastrophic weather event mathematically and permanently reduced the operational radius of the entire expedition before a single major land battle had been fought. The physical geography of the Greek peninsula imposed the next and most immutable constraint upon the invading Persian forces. The landscape is dominated by harsh mountain ranges that naturally channel large armies into narrow, predictable coastal corridors. This rugged topography stripped the Persian military of its greatest tactical asset, which was the wide deployment of highly mobile light cavalry. Instead of overwhelming the Greeks on open plains, the Persian columns were forced to engage heavy infantry in confined spaces like Thermopylae. Geography essentially acted as a force multiplier for the defenders, reducing the massive Persian numbers from a strategic advantage to a logistical liability. While geography restricted movement, the intrinsic agricultural poverty of Greece created a secondary, far more lethal constraint regarding time. The Persian army was far too large to winter in the conquered territories without experiencing catastrophic levels of starvation and disease. This heavy reliance on a specialized naval supply chain meant that the Persian expedition had a strictly enforced operational deadline before seasonal storms made shipping impossible. The structural necessity of completing the conquest before the autumn gales tightly tethered the Persian advance to the unpredictable variables of the Aegean climate. Time itself became an active combatant, continuously draining the strategic patience of the Persian high command. Political legitimacy presented a final structural constraint that dictated the operational pace of the Achaemenid Emperor. Xerxes was leading a multi-ethnic coalition of subjugated nations whose loyalty depended entirely on the perception of his absolute invincibility. A protracted, grinding campaign in a distant, peripheral zone risked exposing weakness, which could easily trigger massive rebellions in wealthier provinces like Egypt or Babylon. The emperor could not afford to become bogged down in a multi-year war of attrition against impoverished city-states. This political reality demanded a rapid, spectacular victory, further narrowing the strategic options available to the invading forces. This careful orchestration of constraints created a severe escalation trap for the Persian high command during their advance toward Athens. Xerxes could not simply bypass the Greek blocking forces at the Isthmus of Corinth without stretching his fragile supply lines to the point of complete rupture. The autumn storm season was rapidly approaching, threatening to sever the maritime supply chain and trap his massive army in Europe without provisions. The Persian emperor was structurally forced to seek a rapid, decisive naval victory to secure his logistical network before the weather made operations impossible. Every alternative to immediate engagement carried the unacceptable risk of a slow, unmanageable starvation across the entire expeditionary force. The Greek coalition deliberately weaponized this Persian desperation by positioning their fleet in the narrow, treacherous straits of Salamis. Hellenic commanders recognized that defeating the Persian armada in open water was mathematically impossible due to the superior numbers and maneuverability of the Imperial ships. By presenting a seemingly trapped fleet, they provided Xerxes with an irresistible opportunity to resolve his logistical and political crises in a single afternoon. The Persian command made a highly rational decision to attack based on pressing structural constraints, but that decision triggered a catastrophic tactical escalation. Entering the confined straits completely nullified their numerical advantage, transforming a naval battle into a brutal, confined infantry brawl on the decks of the ships. Once the heavier Greek triremes engaged the Persian fleet within the narrows, the operational flexibility of the Imperial armada instantly evaporated. The confined space caused the massive Persian fleet to foul its own lines, turning their overwhelming numbers into a deadly traffic jam. Ship captains could not execute their superior ramming and flanking maneuvers, forcing them into a grinding war of attrition they were not equipped to fight. The destruction of the Persian fleet was not a stroke of luck, but the mechanical result of forcing a complex system to operate outside its designated parameters. The trap had successfully weaponized the geography of the sea to dismantle the logistical engine of the empire. The destruction of the Persian fleet at Salamis marked the exact moment where all viable alternatives vanished for the imperial invasion. Without absolute naval supremacy, the Persian army could no longer be reliably supplied with the massive quantities of grain required for its survival. Furthermore, the loss of the fleet meant that the Greek navy could theoretically sail north and destroy the pontoon bridges across the Hellespont. This strategic threat meant that Xerxes risked being entirely severed from his empire, a situation that would undoubtedly trigger his assassination and widespread rebellion. The accumulated constraints of geography, agricultural scarcity, and logistical dependency finally locked history into its inevitable path. Xerxes was mathematically forced to immediately withdraw the bulk of his army back to Asia to prevent total systemic starvation and political collapse. He left behind a significantly reduced force under the command of Mardonius, transitioning the campaign from a massive invasion to a limited occupation. This remaining Persian force was now perfectly sized to be supplied by the limited land routes, but critically undersized for the task of conquering the Peloponnese. Mardonius found himself trapped in a hostile barren landscape, unable to force the Greek coalition to surrender and unable to advance through fortified isthmuses. The geopolitical dynamic had fundamentally shifted, transforming the Persian military from an unstoppable invading force into an isolated, vulnerable garrison. Beyond sheer logistics, the remaining Persian forces suffered from a profound intelligence deficit regarding the political resilience of the Greek city-states. Mardonius relied heavily on diplomatic bribery, assuming that the fragmented Greek coalition would eventually collapse under the weight of its own internal rivalries. He correctly calculated that the agricultural devastation of Attica would place immense economic pressure on the Athenian populace to capitulate. However, he fundamentally misjudged the structural binding power of the Spartan military commitment to their northern allies. When Sparta finally mobilized its full demographic reserves and marched north, the Persian diplomatic strategy instantly evaporated, forcing a military confrontation. The following year, the Persian commander attempted to break this strategic deadlock by luring the unified Greek army into the open plains near Plataea. This maneuver was a highly rational attempt to finally utilize his superior cavalry and on flat terrain to achieve a decisive victory. However, political friction and logistical strain within the Persian camp forced Mardonius to commit his infantry against the heavy hoplite formations of the Spartans and Athenians. The Persian infantry, lacking the heavy armor and long spears of their Greek counterparts, were systematically dismantled in brutal close-quarters combat. The Battle of Plataea ended in the complete annihilation of the isolated Persian army, concluding the invasion permanently. The failure of the Persian Empire to conquer Greece was not a testament to moral superiority or divine intervention. It was the mechanical result of an imperial logistical system being stretched beyond its absolute breaking point by an uncompromising geographical filter. The Persian state possessed the wealth and manpower to dominate the ancient world, but it lacked the technology to overcome the systemic friction of the Greek peninsula. A massive army that cannot be fed becomes a massive liability, proving that demographic superiority is meaningless without the infrastructure to sustain it. The survival of the Hellenic city-states demonstrates that even the most formidable military apparatus cannot function when completely severed from its structural foundations. Viewing this conflict through the lens of individual heroism or tragic failure obscures the profound mechanics of ancient interstate competition. The decisions made by both the Persian High Command and the Greek coalition were meticulously calculated responses to extreme environmental, economic, and political limitations. When a continent-spanning empire attempts to project power into a resource-poor, highly fragmented geographic zone, the result is governed by structural physics rather than pure willpower. The Greeks systematically leveraged their environmental constraints to build an inescapable strategic cage around the greatest logistical machine of the era. The outcome of the Greco-Persian Wars stands as a cold, reflective reminder that wars are ultimately won by the systems that sustain armies. The political map of the Aegean remained unchanged in 479 BC because the physical realities of the ancient world demanded it. The Persian Empire continued to thrive for centuries, proving that this defeat was merely a peripheral setback rather than a systemic collapse. However, the limit of their expansion had been scientifically established by the hard borders of agricultural output, maritime logistics, and rugged topography. The dust settled over the battlefields of Plataea and Salamis, revealing not a triumph of liberty, but the triumph of distance and terrain over human ambition. History is not forged by destiny, but by the rigid, unforgiving architecture of constraints.
Subscribe for channel for new updates.